Glad to be back here. Thank you. I'm going to pass this off to Catherine pretty quick. She's going to cover the calculation for use value appraisal for forest land. Today, we'll start there. There were a couple of questions at the last committee meeting that we hadn't responded to. We wanted to touch on those, and then leave the door open for any questions. So fortunately, we had some practice with this yesterday. The current use advisory board met to settle on this year's use value calculation. So this is 25 hours old. So I'll pass it to Catherine.
Thank you. So Catherine Servideo, I'm the Forest Economy Program Manager with FPR, and I'm the one who does this calculation every year. So I'm hopeful that I'll be able to clear up any mysteries about it. It's actually fairly straightforward, so I'm hopeful. And please feel free to interrupt with questions. I've been living this formula for the better part of a week, and it's easy to get lost in it for me. So at the top of that screen, you can see the mathematical formula written out. And then this slide just kind of covers the variables that go into that. So first up is the harvest stumpage value. That's the total of the 10-year average of harvest volumes multiplied by the average stumpage value per species. Stumpage value is just the cut, skid, and haul per unit. So it's by board feet or cord or ton of a timber product. And the harvest volumes, that data is collected by me with FPR. So this year we use the 2023 harvest data. The stumpage values, I also collect those. It's a survey I send out quarterly. So it's the previous 4 quarters that we use for that. The unharvested stumpage value factor, this is actually just the growth to removals ratio, which I've talked about before in this committee. So that is just indicates to us the growth per unit of removals on the landscape. So the growth of trees per the amount that we're removing. And that data is from the U.S. Forest Service. And for this year's use value calculation, it uses the 2022 inventory data. The forested acres, so it's the area of forest land in Vermont in acres, again from the Forest Service, and that's 2022 inventory data. The management factor is a constant, so it's the same every year, and it's set at 25%, and it has been in place for at least 20 years that has been there. The discount rate, this is part of our capitalization rate, so we use the 10-year average of the nominal rate of U.S. Treasury securities, the 30-year U.S. Treasury securities, to calculate our discount rate. And then the effective tax rate, which is given to us by the Department of Taxes. The discount rate and the effective tax rate together are essentially our capitalization rate that gives us the present value of that remaining stumpage on the landscape. So I have just a few slides that show you some trends over time. This is the total harvest value over time. 2023 was an interesting year. It was not great ground conditions for logging and harvesting. So we did see a continued decline in the volume of harvest that occurred. But because of that reduced volume, even more so than what we would probably normally see, it's a pure supply and demand factor here. The stumpage values went up quite a bit because logs were hard to come by for a lot of mills. So that's why we see an increase for that year. And then our forest land acres and growth to removals. I do want to say, I realize that forest land acres line looks kind of scary. It is, if you have to be a little bit careful, it's actually a really narrow range on that vertical axis. So when you look at it at a larger period of time, it is actually pretty flat. It's just that shrunk in like that, it looks pretty significant.
So looking at the left vertical axis there, it's not a 0 at the bottom, it's
right.
4 million.
Yeah, a little over 4,300,000. And then the top is 4,600 or 4,600,000.
And this is forest land acres in the state. So I guess we've heard a number of times, 4.5 million, roughly, that's what this
It's
is
right around there.
showing.
Yeah, just continues. There's fluctuations from year to year just because how the inventory estimates it, but it's pretty steady when you look at it.
Representative O'Brien?
Catherine, do you use that previous formula? Do you use that same formula for forest land acres even on the one where you're so far away from a class one,
Yes.
2, or 3 road?
Yes, so when you're greater than a mile from the road, then it's 75% of the use that's.
Okay.
Yeah, in the growth removals, you've seen a steady increase, and has not been published yet, but the 2023 inventory, it ticks back up a little bit. So we continue to be at just around 3 to 1, so we're growing 3 times the volume that's being removed from the landscape. Discount rate and the effective tax rate. So this is because it's a 10-year average, that discount rate can look kind of strange. It has a really kind of a parabolic like movement to it because back in the early 2000s, it just had a lot of old data that kept it very, very high. And so as it's moved, that running average has moved, it's gone lower, and now we're starting to see a little bit of a pick back up. So now the numbers. So I've got 2025 all the way to the left, and then a couple years back. So for the 2025 calculation, the annual harvest stumpage value, so that's the volumes removed with the average stumpage, was a little bit or just shy of $31 million. That unharvested stumpage value factor, that growth to removals ratio at 2.85. So we multiply those two things together. And that lets us estimate how much of that value is remaining on the landscape. From growing about 3 to 1, then that's how you figure out, like, we know how much we removed, now we got to estimate what's on the land still. And then divided by forested acres to get it at a per acre basis. And then you take that same number, so multiply it by the 25% management factor, and then do a subtraction. So that gives you your net operating income per acre for forest land. We divide that by the capitalization rate, and that turns into the calculated use value, which for 2025 is $318.52. But there's another part of this calculation that comes into play here. We now take an average, a 5-year average, to smooth it out even further, because I think Ryan Patch from Ag was in here earlier and he said, the year to year it can ping pong quite a bit. And so we take another average just to smooth that out a little bit. So we take the 2025 calculated rate and then the set UVA rate for the previous 4 years and average that together. And so that comes into the use value forest land is $203. Greater than a mile is 75% of that at $152.
So this is what we end up with is a use value per acre
Yes.
of forest land, either within a mile or greater than a mile
Sure.
from a road. Questions?
You guys can all do it now.
No, I think this is great, looking at it this way, presenting it this way. And I think if we want to dig into it with questions, it gives us a good starting point to sort of think about how do we think about this. So, John. Yeah.
Not digging into this any deeper, but I just had a question about forest in general. And I think we talked about this a little bit last time, but if we start with our middle-aged forests here in Vermont, managing them, do they almost always contain the same amount of carbon? So say we did nothing, or we thin them and what grows back, or we created holes in them like we saw in Little River, or we clear cut them. do they all, balance out to about the same amount of, mass carbon in them? Do you see what I'm saying?
I think this would be a great question for Ali Kasiba.
Uh-huh.
The carbon does change over time because there are different pools of carbon above ground and below ground. Different management activities and changes over time can influence those pools. And there has been some good work looking at what are those pools and how are they changing over time and what can affect those. But I think it's a deep dive. I'm not prepared to speak to it in detail with a lot of accuracy. It's not static, and it does change. And there's a lot of influencing factors related to that. And it's a pretty cool thing to dig into. Might be worthwhile, though I know you're also very busy.
And maybe carbon's not quite even what I'm after. It's sort of the biomass, like our forests just even themselves out almost no matter what you do. There's a certain amount of stumpage takes them away and it creates, faster growth. Or if you completely clear cut it, you have an explosion of growth of biomass coming in. So I just wondered sort of what we have in Vermont is forests want a certain amount, of that biomass, no matter how little or big the trees are.
Yeah, I think Keith's answer probably is still the
Okay.
same, because growth rates change over
Yeah.
time, they slow down, and so it's a little bit complicated to answer.
Mhm.
I will say, just like on the carbon, it's important to kind of distinguish between carbon storage and carbon sequestration.
Yeah.
Because depending on what it is we're talking about, the answers could be very different.
Yeah.
Let's see.
I'm going to try to make a question out of this, not provide testimony, but I'll start with the question. And this is one of the exciting things about Vermont's forests, percentage of Vermont's landscape that is forested. I've heard a statistic, maybe the most recent one, is that Vermont's forest land has mitigated 67% of the greenhouse gases that are coming into our landscape. And that probably includes swirling around the earth. What might it have been 10 years ago or 3 years ago if we had more like a 2.3% growth to harvest? Would that be a way to sort of categorize the trend that Representative O'Brien was asking about? Danny, are you familiar with, let's say?
I know what you're talking about, and that the figure that you're quoting is Keith shared Ali Kasiba's latest or soon to be released forest carbon inventory. I think there's a lot of variables again that goes into this.
Yeah.
Is that a question we might want to save for?
I would recommend bringing Ali in. She is about to release the latest forest carbon inventory. And she can really, she looks at all the pools, she even looks at stored wood products, and so she really got a good idea on the landscape and can probably show you trends over time, at least since the last one, because she did the last one too.
And this may be more in a comment aspect. The Little River operation that we observed was a little 110 acres. We didn't walk the whole thing, but it had, a lot of smaller clear cuts, pearl cuts. But we need to comprehend that that was 0.01% of that forest block, the Mount Mansfield State Forest. So this active management, while it made a positive impact, and that primary objective was bird habitat creation or management, but it was a very tiny percentage of what's really being actively managed. Thank you for letting me told me.
All right, I'm going to bring us back to the formula. And before I do
Chairman.
that, Yeah, we have Representative Burt and then Representative Nelson.
Yeah, and one thing that's on my radar based on looking at ag use and forest land, seeing the increase in the forest use value and the ag use value over like a 10-year period. I think, I don't remember which slide it was from last week or the week before. It showed how much it increased in 10 years. And then compared to what we looked at for what dairy farmers are getting paid over the last 10 years and how their price is the same for what they're getting paid. But yet the land, if it's ag use, they're paying quite a bit more per acre now in taxes. But it's supposed to be based on the use of the land, not necessarily the value of the land. If it's based more on the value of the product coming off, I'm not sure why there's been basically a doubling in the ag use value, whereas they're getting paid the same amount. And that's not even factoring in inflation to show their net profits are probably super tight. And that's kind of similar to like here, I'm just looking at the calculations based on annual harvest stumpage value, which is kind of a gross income from harvests across the state, it sounds like. But I'm guessing it doesn't look like it factors in how many acres that was taken off of.
So,
Or is it?
well, so it's all divided by the total forest land acres, so we calculate this on a per acre basis.
But it's the total forest, and it's not actually the amount of land it was. But that the harvest came off of itself.
Correct, yeah, because the harvest stumpage value is that gross income number, but when we multiply it by the growth to removals ratio, what we actually are what we're estimating at that point is how much stumpage value remains on the land and would be
Yes.
available for harvest to those landowners as income.
So directionally, and I don't want to interrupt Greg if you had more that you wanted to say, but so there's the analogous forestry situation where I think that loggers haven't been making more per truckload this year than they were 10 years ago, that they're probably earning less. If that's not the case, then you can stop me. But it hasn't been, annually they're getting more and more. How, if that's the case, how do we think about that? And how is that reflected in the?
It's not reflected in this at all.
It's not reflected. So then instead of that being reflected, what is it that's driving? So I'm looking at 2021, $152. And now 4 years later, it's up to 200. So that's about a 33% increase roughly. What is it? What has changed? Can you just speak to what, and we see all the numbers, but maybe you can just sort of say why is it up that much?
Yeah, so probably the biggest factor is there's a couple of big factors. One is that growth to removals ratio, because that's a multiplication that occurs. So that as that increases, as that gets closer to 3, you're going to see a larger number.
Just because there's more.
It's more we're growing
Potential.
more, yes.
There's more potential there.
Yes. And then the capitalization rate, so as the effective tax rate goes down, and when you have a smaller number as your denominator, it's just, so as the discount rate goes down, you end up with a larger use value.
The effective tax rate has gone down quite a lot.
Yes.
$2.17 to 170. Richard, I know you were waiting to ask a question too, but could you just, because I'm not sure I understand the effective tax rate, what that represents.
We had the same question yesterday.
That would be the effective tax rate.
If all of the parcels were,
So Jill Remick is maybe watching this and is going to,
Get here tomorrow.
we'll have a chance to correct me. And so don't quote me on this, but if I recall, we talked about this yesterday. And it's basically what the tax rate would be if all the properties on the grand list were appraised at full value,
Yes,
and that would be the effective tax.
and this is the non-homestead tax.
Yes.
rate.
Right, well, okay, we'll have her, we have a chance to confirm that. Representative Nelson.
Yeah, thank you. Are you the same person that made up the how to fund education in the state of Vermont with the formula we use? That's an aside. Is this same value used for preserved forest land that's in current use?
Yeah, so this is used for all forest land in current use.
Thank you.
Representative Lipsky.
I'm gonna go to the top of the HSV annual harvest stumpage value. And I'm thinking about, obviously, chip wood is a low-end product that you may value at $10 a ton, from a stumpage perspective, or I don't know what you value it at. But because there are chip markets, state buildings, universities, colleges, hospitals, schools, all over the state that are consumers of this low-grade volume. But I've observed that, particularly with these whole tree harvests, we're leaving less coarse woody debris in the forest. It's coming out. Is that value based on delivered to the market?
Yes, so the annual harvest surveys are mill surveys.
Okay,
So those are consumers like of logs, of chips that report back their volumes to me.
and in many of those cases, the transport is a significant cost.
Right,
Maybe they're converted to chips on the landing, but the transport to get them all over the state is a high cost. So to Representative Burt's point about, the profitability may be actually going down because high costs for harvest, higher costs for fuel, higher costs for maintenance or repair, and definitely higher costs for transport makes the whole enterprise
Oh, excuse me.
more razor thin to not being viable, quite frankly.
yeah, so this calculation wouldn't you wouldn't be able to interpret that from this equation. So that the stumpage survey goes out to consulting foresters, and so they report on their sales, what the price is per unit for their sales. So that transportation cost, that intermediary cost would not be captured.
To be clear, this is the value that the landowner received,
Correct.
which excludes all those trucking costs and all those other expenses.
Okay, so that's not delivered to the market. Going with stumpage values
On the land.
returned to the landowner.
Correct.
And that's what I assume that the stumpage would be.
Yeah, I'm sorry to jump in. I feel like Keith, I don't think we talked about it last time when we were here, but Representative Burt's question about how it is for dairy right now, and maybe the history of how we had like multiple use values at one time and how that sort of phased out. Maybe help.
Yeah, so
I can remember that, yeah, on another slide, but.
historically, early on in the program, there was an effort to be really precise and focused on the income generation potential of different sites. And so based on site class and soil productivity, there would be three or four different use values for forest land. One for really rich soils that are growing balm or sugar maple, a different use value for wetlands that have limited or no potential to grow saw timber. And then there would be four more use values for all those same lands that are greater than a mile from class 1, 2, or 3 roads. And then there was another several categories for ag land based on multiple crops and the income generation of potential of those different uses. And so there was a real intention early on to break things down as precisely. And I think at the time, an effort to be as accurate as possible with it, which is a legitimate intention. The reality is that we are valuing these lands on a per acre basis. And to then define, is this site class 1, 2, or 3, or 4 soils? And map it out accurately, and then find maybe this, we didn't map it right. We're wrapping ourselves around the axle and pulled back. And can you imagine the work at the tax department of calculating each use value and how many different categories for every single parcel? So it was pulled back to the 3 base use values. And then it blends all of it together. And there have been questions in the past, came up with reserve forest land. Is that the use value here is based on income generation from saw timber, yet reserve forest land may produce income from saw timber, but in many cases won't. Is that the appropriate use value? That's a fair question, but would it then extend to white pine stands versus beech stands versus sugar bushes versus and the list goes on of variable conditions that have variable income generating potentials.
Representative Brick.
This is more stuff to the committee to think about. I just feel like it would be nice to see a reflection in the use value or reflected toward the actual stumpage price for what landowners are receiving. Because I'd be curious to know what the stumpage value average was in 2021 versus 2025. Is it, 33% less value? Just seeing, I think I'm a little worried about seeing how much the use value's gone up versus what people are getting paid, essentially.
Just the top line there, I'm still not quite clear. The annual harvest stumpage value, that is a function of how much is removed from the forest in a particular year?
Yeah, so it's the 2023 harvest volumes that were reported to me by mills that consume Vermont wood products. So that's Vermont mills, as well as surrounding states, all the way to Pennsylvania, Ohio, includes Canada. They all send in their volumes as to what they got from Vermont. So that's what that volume is. And then the stumpage values for different species as reported by consulting foresters in Vermont for their sales. So that's 4 quarters of that. So a full year of stumpage values, we just multiply those together to determine what was that year's volume worth. What was the value?
Can you share, what's the resolution of that? So a mill reports on a volume of a species?
Of a species, of a product. So they'll tell me if it was saw timber, if it went for pulp, if they resold it, if it was chips. Yeah, if they went to veneer for our one veneer mill, yes. And they do it by species, and if they have it available to me, they also tell me what county it came from.
So then we take the values from the consulting foresters, and for the volume of sugar maple saw logs that were reported, they received a certain stumpage as reported by the consulting foresters. We multiply the volume times the value, and that is one line on the annual harvest stumpage value. Then we go to the next species and the next species and the next product and so on, and then add it all up.
Yeah, and I just want to say again, there's a lot of averaging that happens in this equation. So that that harvest volume is a 10-year average. So I use the 2023 data into that, but it is a 10-year average.
There's a lot of intention is to smooth things.
Right, yes.
There aren't.
Right, because if you only looked at what we did in 2023, there would be a tremendous amount left behind. Yeah, so.
Representative O'Brien?
How does firewood fit into that equation?
Yeah, so we do have firewood. We have our, and it's not annual. The last one we did was in 2018-19 heating season. So we have a residential fuel survey that we do when we have grant funds available, and we actually have grant funds available, so we'll be doing it again this year. So that's where we get our firewood volumes. And in that stumpage survey, consulting foresters report on what they sell firewood for.
Spending.
So Catherine, first of all, you did not create the education fund formula. I'm just sure that nobody thinks you did. And you didn't create this formula either.
No, this is a pretty textbook income approach for appraisal. If you picked up any forest economics textbook, you would see essentially this equation.
Yeah, go ahead, Representative.
Just one more question about how is the effective tax rate decided? I think we already touched on this, but let's see a little more clarification. Like who decides what it is and how?
Department of Taxes.
I think we'll have Jill Remick, who's coming up
Yes,
tomorrow,
yes.
try and dig into that. Yeah, okay. So Catherine, you're involved with, or the department, did you involved with trying to get the top line number here? And then the second line is also a number that you are.
So that's from the Forest Service, from the Forest Inventory and Analysis.
Okay.
The second and third, so that stumpage value factor and the forested acres, those both come from the US Forest Service.
Okay, they supply those. Is the management factor that's been steady, as you pointed out?
Constant.
And there's you're not asked to determine whether that number should change from year to year?
No.
I mean, it'd be interesting for us to also look into ag here because, I mean, you guys know, I mean, every acre of forest has a lot of different potential to it, for what it can create as far as revenue goes. And farmland would be just the same, even though it's one value per farmland acre, right? So, the difference between a sheep pasture and someone growing alfalfa would be enormous.
Right.
We'll acknowledge that during the current use advisory board meetings, the management factor has been discussed. It's been static, as we stated, for a long time. And yet the management costs, development of management plans, dealing with invasive plants, repairing roads following floods, those are costs associated with maintaining and managing forest land that have changed over time. And some of the specific inputs going into the management factor maybe are a little opaque due to time and history. There has been a question of, is this appropriate right now? And it seems like costs are going up and yet the management factor is not. That's not to suggest that. And so it would be a board decision to recommend any reconsideration of this calculation or others, but recognizing that there was discussion about elements of the agricultural calculation, there were some parallel discussions which are not certain enough to have a conclusion or a known fix. And certainly would have implications, as I mentioned in the previous presentation. Any changes to this will have implications for the whole program that need to be considered as well.
And just, backing up to remind us, we were asked to, we've had a couple of conversations about current use, and I know there's some possible legislation coming that would, look at the program, but we were asked to look at it now because of the larger questions around the education funding system, and recognizing that the education fund right now is where we had the conversation about, is it a cost or is it something else? And in any case, there's a certain amount of funding associated with that. So if this were to change, if you know, collectively the legislature, the board were to decide that, you know, oh, actually, we're going to be using a different formula that would have an impact on the education fund. So be conscious of that. And an impact on landowners, on the entire industries, yeah. For good or for bad, depending which way things went. All right. Well, this actually, I think this has been a great conversation. Did you have anything else that you wanted to say about any of this
There
or
were
other things that have come
A
up?
couple of things. I wanted to follow up on a couple of questions from the last presentation, if it's okay to shift gears.
Yeah. Okay.
So the first was that one of my slides from the last presentation, and I was celebrating the value of the forest economy, and there was a question of the 1.4 billion of direct output from the forest economy, and the question was, what goes into that? The time Catherine wasn't here, I used her name in vain, and voila, here she
I've
is.
appeared.
She's appeared. So I was wondering if maybe she could answer that for the committee.
Yeah.
Good, yeah.
I'm happy to. I will say I'm not entirely sure what exactly you're looking for as far as like what goes into that. So I'll just start by saying that direct output includes labor income, includes total output. So that's like sales of products and value add. So those are kind of the three pieces of that direct economic contribution of the forest industry. As far as like subsectors within that, it includes forestry, maple sap production, logging, primary wood manufacturing, secondary wood manufacturing, furniture, pulp paper, paperboard. I think that might be it. Apologies.
I don't remember whether I asked a question or who asked the question, but thank you for answering it.
Okay.
And another was how much forest land is enrolled on farms? I believe you asked that question. And so for farmers, as we know, there are farmers and non-farmers, and there's lands that have ag land, but they're not owned by a farmer. So of the parcels enrolled by farmers, there are about 2,200 parcels enrolled by farmers that also have forest land enrolled. And that's about 125,000 acres of forest land that's enrolled on UVA enrolled parcels that is owned by a farmer. There's also about 3,800 parcels that have both forest land and active agricultural land enrolled in the program. And that's about 375,000 acres of forest land are enrolled on those parcels. And of those 3,800 parcels, about 3,200 require forest management plans. So remembering that parcels that are owned by a farmer and have less than 25 acres of forest land enrolled can enroll forest land without requiring a forest management plan. Sorry for the delay in the response.
Were there others? Was that?
Those were the questions I
Okay.
had.
Any other questions? When we think about you were alluding to the time in the past, distant past, maybe when there were more than three categories. There were lots of categories, and that you tried to look more specifically at perhaps the type of wood, or whether it was good land or whether it was not good land. Just thinking now, we've had just over the past, few recent years, a lot more of sugaring happening on Vermont land. Is there any sort of qualitative way of looking at, if you take a stand of trees that you're previously were managing just for timber, and now you decide, oh, I can tap these trees. Does that like instantly make those trees more valuable? Partly thinking that, well, okay, you're getting value out of it, but maybe if you're not going to be logging it, you're also taking away some value.
I don't think that there's anything instant when we're doing working land stuff. There may be more value depending on the site, depending on the sugaring operation, and I'm not a sugaring expert. The department did crunch some numbers and prepared a report on sugaring in the past. I even think that the conclusions and some of the details may have evolved since issuing that report. But at that time, we did look at what is the value of sugaring, and there are different income streams and there are very different costs. And I think it would require a lot of consideration with the sugaring community to understand, well, what is the real income and what is the real cost of this? There are some folks who are really excited and successfully pursuing sugaring, and it's providing real value for them. There are others who are pursuing and have gone out of business recently, and so I think that there is a viable opportunity for folks because it's revenue generating. There's a lot of other values that come with it, and it's really complex, and any consideration of how that might be approached would need to, I think, be really carefully considered with the sugaring community.
All right. Did anybody else have any questions or
I
thoughts?
mean, just thinking of sugaring, so if I had, big time sugar, say I had 10,000 acres of trees I'm tapping. Does the tax department ever say those should go in as agriculture at that acreage?
No,
They don't.
that is a choice of the landowner who has land that is eligible either as agricultural land and would be taxed at a higher rate and not subject to forest management requirements associated with forest land, or they can enroll in the forest land category, and like every other landowner enrolling land in the forest land category needs to have a forest management plan, needs to submit forest management activity reports, and so on. The vast majority of sugar makers enroll in the forest land category, and I'm glad it's that way, frankly. I think it's good to have the opportunity. Small sugar makers, less than 25 acres, have the opportunity to enroll in the program in the agricultural category. Other sugar makers who are managing a really important piece of forest land are doing so in a really rigorous way with a lot of working lands and ecological benefits coming from that. I'll make a note briefly on the sugaring. I don't know what the magic number would be. How much land needs to be in a single use to warrant pursuing another use value category? We estimate, and it's a very rough estimate, but maybe there's 150,000 acres of sugar bush out there.
Out of 4.5.
Out of 4.5, and certainly the 2 million acres enrolled in forest land in use value. And the difference between the value of a high value sugar maple stand and the difference in the value of that or a beech stand, American beech, the difference is likely comparable. And I'm going to back away from the comparable piece. There's vast differences in those values. And yet it's appropriate to apply it's administratable to apply a use value, and we're comfortable with that approach. And I think that we need to be thoughtful about, if we are going to carve out specific use values for specific uses, when are we gonna do that and why? And are we being consistent in our granularity with other uses or other potential values from our forest land? Again, I don't know the answer, but it's one of the things I've racked my brain about. How do we do this best? What's fair? And what can we deliver as a program?
All right, thank you. Thank you for coming in.
I prepared a quiz for everybody
Right.
on the use value equation.
Won't sleep tonight, yeah.
Give me an app and I'll.
Your time.
I thought she was serious for a second.
All right, Representative Nelson, did you have anything to add before we sign off? All right, I hope to see you.
You're definitely taking the test.
Did Ryan go over, there's a similar equation then for ag?
Yeah,
Yes, similar, right?
yeah, it's slightly different.
Yeah.
They have a risk portion of their capitalization rate. Yeah,
And there's
slightly different.
based
Use
on
rental.
rates.
Yeah.
Okay.
The student rate.
All right, we're gonna wrap up for the day and unless anybody has anything else, all right, we'll be back on,